here in Amsterdam, and my colleague on this Methods Clinic venture, Perry Schwartz-Shea, is over there in Utah in Salt Lake City. Welcome to the fourth in this series of Methods Clinics. I was asked to remind everybody that we are recording, as we have in the past clinics, and that we will upload the recording and a resource sheet that Perry and I have pulled together with assistance from our two guests to the Interpretive Methodologies and Methods webpage later today if we can, and otherwise at the beginning of next week. And Fred Schaefer, are you still there? I could acknowledge you at this point. Hi, Fred. As the chair of the Executive Committee of the Interpretive Methodologies and Methods Conference Group at the American Political Science Association, one of our co-sponsors, along with the Women's Caucus in Political Science, which is also at the American Political Science Association. And we are hosted in this session at the University of Utah. Thank you, Perry, for organizing that. Thank you, Devin Cantwell, who is a PhD student currently at the University of Utah, but about to move over to the University of Ottawa. Devin is serving as our tech guru this time. And thanks also to Zachary Stickney, who is also a doctoral student at the University of Utah, who's going to be managing the chat this time. And I want to welcome then our two co-hosts, our guests for this session on interviewing. One is Dr. Nadia Brown from Purdue University. Hi, Nadia. And the other is Professor Robin Harper from York College at the City University of New York. This is the second of three sessions in which we're taking up methods for generating data. Those of you who've participated before, I don't know if you paid attention to that. It wasn't something that Perry and I intended from the start, but as we've been working through the questions that the first group of 51 registrants sent us at our request to help us manage these sessions, once it became clear that we weren't going to be 15 or 20 people sitting around a table and chatting seminar style. We've been using those, and this organizational logic came from our engagement with those questions. So last time we talked about ethnography, that is observing with whatever degree of participating. And today we pick up interviewing. At the end of the session today, I'll have something to say about the next two clinics. So before we launch, I want to say something about interviewing and our approach to it today. Lots of researchers interview, but interpretive interviewing is different in various ways from other approaches. For me, something that Malcolm Chapman wrote in a 2001 book chapter captures the spirit of the differences. This is a passage that Perry and I quoted in the Interpretation and Method book in both editions. Chapman was describing the reactions of a colleague of his, someone trained as an economist in survey research, and comparing his reactions with his own, Chapman having trained as an anthropologist, but the two of them were collaborating on a research project. And Chapman said, quote, "I think my colleague at the time viewed what the textbooks call unstructured interviews as a subset of interviews. I regarded it as a subset of talking to people." So let's talk to some people. Perry?
Okay, I want to first lay out the structure of the session so everybody is aware of what that is, and then I'll introduce our first two question askers. So the organization of the session for today is that we're going to have two 30-minute segments. Then within each segment, either Devor or I will ask two people to make to articulate their questions for everyone. And at that point, then our guests, Robin Harper and Nadia Brown, will hop in with their takes on the questions. And after that, there'll be a chance for Zach, who is monitoring the chat, to bring in some comments or questions from everyone before we move on to the second session, which is similarly structured. Then at the end, we'll have 15-minute breakout rooms, so you'll get a chance to meet some people in small groups. And there'll be a little signal, of course, that tells you that we're all coming back together for the farewell and for the information about the May and June clinics. So let me introduce the two question askers. And the first one, and please unmute yourself, is Celine Yilmaz, and please correct my name pronunciation if you need to be,
It was very, thank you.
from the University of Basel. So Celine.
Yeah, my question is about the subjectivity of interpretation, which is always very much criticized by the audience and readers, or for example, in conferences or in such areas, especially on culturally sensitive issues. When we make interviews on them, more or less our political views are engaged with the subject. For example, in order to clarify it, if I go to Turkey, I'm from Turkey originally, actually. If I go to Turkey and make a research with the Armenian community on the Armenian genocide, for example, let's say that I have 5 participants and I'm making interview with them, and another researcher who has more nationalistic views is doing the same or similar interview with the same participants. We will have, of course, very different results regarding, of course, our worldviews. And it is very much criticized in the scientific areas. So, and in those cases which are very sensitive, when we're talking about traumas or like genocides, we cannot just put or show very solid documents or pictures. We are rely on the stories of people, and of course we have to interpret them. So how can we make them more, quote unquote, sensitive, so objective, or how can we reduce this subjectivity? This is my question.
Okay, thank you, Celine.
Thank you very much.
So our second question, please unmute yourself, is from An Lee, who is a PhD student at Western University. An?
Yes, yeah. Hi, everyone.
Hey.
Yeah, so thank you so much for having me, like to have a chance to pose my question about like IPA. So in my doctoral project in policy education, like I have an opportunity to use IPA to conduct data analysis. So my data are composed of like policy document and semi-structure with interview with university leaders. So this is my question. To what extent can I interpret the meaning of artifacts such as metaphor and policy object so that we cannot go too far from the meaning communicated by the interviewees?
Okay, thank you very much, An. Did you want to say a bit more about that question?
Yes, I want to elaborate a bit more about my situation. So in my first draft of my chapter, I present the finding of my data analysis. So I submitted to my supervisor. And I use the structure of data analysis, like I use a metaphor that participant use in my interview, and then I also use policy object. When I submit my finding chapter to my supervisor, she keeps saying that, like, we need to know more the meaning of metaphor and object. So I read her suggestion and I try to make it clear the meaning from what participant want to communicate with me. But she want more from that metaphor and object. But I cannot go too far from their what they share with me. So to what limit we try to communicate their meaning, but we can meet the like requirement of my supervisor about the meaning of it.
Okay, thank you very much. So Nadia and Robin.
So thank you for the questions. It's a really interesting problem because we start with this idea of what it is that this kind of interviewing is supposed to be doing. And our essential goal is not to uncover some kind of truth that's lying outside, that's waiting to be found, but to look at the shape and the understanding of the issue itself. And so the subjectivity is actually key to understanding what it is that we're talking about. We're not looking for an objective truth, we're looking really for a subjective understanding, and that we can really use everything that we have at our disposal and our who we are, how we look at issues to help us to understand and inform, and also to approach people in the field. That it can be very helpful to be whether you're an insider and an outsider. I'm an outsider in most of the instances where I interview. And I think Nadia will probably talk about, although I don't know, but about being an insider on a lot of the environments where she talks to. So my research deals with citizenship and naturalization, belonging, inclusion, exclusion, and borders, those kinds of questions. And the places where I interview generally are, when I do things in other countries, I'm not a member of either the dominant group or of the immigrant groups that I talk to. So it's a very different kind of interviewing. This allows me to have some sort of a distance and also allows me to be let into a conversation because I'm a safe person to talk to. And I think that's usually a very helpful kind of thing. I think that I should say that some of the training that I got in how to interview also informs the kinds of the ways that I ask questions in these environments to get the broadest possible response. So when I was still in graduate school, we didn't have any program in interviewing in political science. So I went to the one place where they did have it, which was in clinical psychology, and I begged my way in. And I studied with Peter Frankel, and he said, the thing you have to do is to try to figure out where the parameters are, how large the space is. And that through asking these extremely broad questions at the very beginning, you can then set up a parameter and then figure out what the dimensions are of the issue that's at hand. And so every interview begins with a question that's something like, when you think of the word citizenship, say I'm talking about citizenship, when you think about the word citizenship, what comes to mind? And then asking somebody, can you tell me a positive story about citizenship? And then can you tell me a negative story about citizenship? And then situating it within this, it begins like a frame of thinking of how we should look at these kinds of issues. Yeah, so I think that's one way of dealing with this in terms of finding out how, of starting to explore the extent that the keeping it close, I'm sorry, of keeping the idea closer to where the participants are by figuring out what the full breadth of the issue is across multiple interviews. And that gives you like a lot of space to think. Yeah.
So Nadia?
Sure. So many thanks to Perry and Devorah for inviting Robin and I to participate in this fourth clinic. Many thanks to Devin and Zach for being the tech support. This is the new normal of Zoom, but it doesn't mean that it's easy. So I'm 100% appreciative of all of the hard work that's gone into putting these together. And also thank you to all of you who have shown up at various time zones in the middle of the night, very early in the morning. And so I hope that our answers to your questions will spark something in your mind, or also validate some of the things that you have been doing. So to take the answer to the first question for me is, the work that I do, objectivity is never the goal. And so once I rid myself of this objective or this goal in mind, I feel like I'm able to do the work that I want to do, the things that I think will make a difference, not only in academia, the kind of scholarship that I'm trying to speak back to or against, but also in the lives of the people that I'm trying to really showcase their narratives. And you know, I want to be honest that it took me a very long time to be able to say this, not within a quiet, small voice, but in a very loud, proud. I am not seeking to write scholarship that is generalizable or that is objective. Like, no, we all are subjective beings. The study of truth, like Robin said, right, there's multiple sides to truth. It's the small t truth that we're all trying to get to. And if we as researchers are real about this, I think that our general scholarship will be better. So yes, I'm speaking to positivists who think that if you control for enough things, then you'll be able to understand, you know, the X that you're trying to uncover. So I think once you, as an interpretivist, own this, and you are able to I think produce a kind of scholarship that will make you proud, and particularly the people that you're talking with proud, because you're showcasing their stories, their narratives, their experiences, their worldview, which is oftentimes contrary to the dominant view. And you want to show up with sympathy, with care, and with empathy, right? And so I do research on Black women political elites, and to a lesser extent, mass citizens. And as a Black woman myself, I wanted to speak back to this hole in the literature, right? That said that there was no there to study Black women because they all vote the same way. But what I want to show is that they have different political calculus to determine how they get to that vote. And so that requires subjectivity, right? That requires talking to folks to understand the differences, the nuances, the dynamisms, right? How they're making these kind of political calculations. And so in order to do that, I had to be upfront about my positionality, that as a Black woman talking to other Black women, I'm able to you know, uncover things, or things are said to me that allows me to uncover things in the scholarship that probably would not have been said to another researcher with a different social group background or identity. And in a lot of ways, right, back to this question, Celine, about how do you work with the trauma or empathize with the trauma? I think, as well, from my point as an insider, this is things that are readily read on the sleeve, right? So as we speak right now, you know, Black and Brown communities in the United States in particular are right in the midst of the Derek Chauvin trial, where he, you know, police officer that murdered George Floyd. Yesterday, Chicago came out with the video of the killing of a 13-year-old boy, Adam Toledo. There's been numerous, right, Black and Brown children, men and women that have been killed. And as a Black woman doing this kind of research, the legislators that I speak to, the candidates for office, share things with me, and this trauma is on their sleeve, right? They're wearing it around, they're carrying it with them, as all people of marginalized groups, right? Or people that are dealing with over policing and violence. And so the trauma isn't something that I have to dig for or try to present, I think, or try to make coax out of people. In some ways, right, it's the presence of living in this community and understanding the rawness of the emotions, because what people see in their day-to-day lives. And so what my goal to do then is to present this in a very in a way that brings humanity to this group, because the dominant force, right, the dominant discourse frames violence to Black and brown bodies as something that was inevitable, or is something that should not raise an eyebrow, right? So for example, last night on Fox News, the murder of Adam Toledo, a 13-year-old boy, is compared to, what's the guy's name, Zach, the guy who went to Minnesota, and the 17-year-old boy who traveled from Illinois to Minnesota to hurt protesters and killed one. And so it's like, oh, a child, oh, thank you, Kyle Rittenberg. Yes, thank you. So Kyle Rittenberg is framed as, you know, in one way, as someone who was a patriot, who's standing up for American values and life and the way of life. And then there's a 13-year-old boy who was murdered with his hands up and nothing in his arms, right, and following police orders. And then the mainstream culture demonizes this 13-year-old boy. And so when I'm talking to elected officials and other Black women, it's making plain that these are two different things, right? And really showcasing the narratives of empathy that are placed for a certain group aren't afforded to the other. And so this work is empathizing with the trauma, but also using my skills as a political scientist to make sense of what's going on, to make it plain that there are more than just hypothetical how we're thinking about violence and bodies and who deserves justice and who doesn't, but that there are real lived consequences. And I want to be able to make that plain. To respond to Lee's question about metaphor and artifacts, I'll give an example from my dissertation research that turned into the book Sisters in the State House, that I still, it's one of those moments where you're doing, you're interviewing a participant and you want to go back and do something different. You want to say something different. You want to say oh man, I lost this moment. But so I'm talking to a Black woman, an elderly Black woman, state legislator, about same-sex marriage. And this is in 2009. So it's before and our American cultural shift of how we're thinking about queer relationships and same-sex marriage. Really, sidebar, another example of heteropatriarchy, right? Just mapped on to queer bodies. It's reaffirming institutions. But anyway, this legislator, I asked her about how is she going to vote on this bill? What are her thoughts on this bill? And she holds up her Bible and looks me in the eye, as what seemed like forever, but probably was only 2 or 3 seconds, and then puts the Bible down. And then says, next question. And so what that meant to me as a metaphor, right, this artifact of holding up the Bible, says, first of all, that she had on her desk in the State House, right? So she's holding up this Bible to say to me, as a Black woman, she thinks that I understand the popular, or at the time, I guess, popular interpretations of homosexuality and queerness as given to us from these 6 main passages in the Bible, in the Black Protestant tradition. And I did, right? So that's why I was like, okay, I want to move on to the next question. But I wish, right, and Robert and I were talking about this earlier, I should have asked her, what particular part in the Bible are you referring to, right? I maybe should have pushed back on this. But again, at that time, I was just like, oh, she doesn't want to answer. I want to keep the conversation going. So I'll move on. But what I do in the book is I really try to explain how this artifact of the Bible, what this means, why she feels like she doesn't have to answer the question, and that her answer, verbally answer the question, but her answer to the question is reified in her holding up the Bible. And also, right, as an insider, she's viewing me as an insider, right? She's not thinking of me as something other than a Black Christian. I could have been, a practicing Muslim. I could have been an atheist. I could be, right, a Catholic. I could be all sorts of other religions, right? But she's reading on to me that I'm familiar with the Black church and Black biblical teachings of homosexuality. and is not even, asking or pushing back on some of these things. So I think, right, the role of us to interpret these artifacts as metaphors is to try to think about how the person or the group that is introducing this artifact, right, what meaning does it hold for them? How does it operate for them as a political heuristic or a shortcut that might not need the full kind of investigation in ways like this woman did not talk to me about how she was going to vote on the bill, right? As you can probably guess, she voted against same-sex marriage, but right, it was all relayed to me by holding up the Bible. So I'll stop there and move to the second set of questions, I guess.
Perry, I'd like to say something.
Sure. We've got
Yeah,
a few minutes, I believe.
Okay. And I apologize. I usually use a headset, but the mic stopped working on it. I wanted to speak to Anli's question specifically. One, to say to other people that An referred to IPA, which is shorthand for interpretive policy analysis, which is a whole subset, shall we say, of interpretive approaches. It's specific to those doing policy studies and wanting to analyze public policies. Your question is very interesting. I appreciate your adding the greater context because it brought the question to life in a clearer way than what we had originally understood it to be. When one does, whether it's in the context of policy analysis or some other form of analysis, there is a balance to be made between what my professor Don Schoen used to call keeping your hands dirty with the data and contextualizing, whether it's a metaphor or some kind of policy object or some other artifact that we're seeking to analyze, putting that analysis in a broader context. Now, I don't know the specifics of what you're writing or what your professor is asking for, but there's a question to be asked as to whether this metaphor is a metaphor only for the person you have interviewed, or I should say rather, it appears only in that interview, in which case one might consider it particular to this individual, or whether you find the metaphor in other interviews or in written documents or in, let's say, radio or television broadcasts. In other words, is it a characteristic of the policy issue itself? And then you need to decide if it's only something that shows up in his interview, is it central to your analysis of the issue as a whole? So for example, if we take Nadia's story about the woman holding up, the congresswoman holding up the Bible, to understand that draws on a wide range of other sense making that was available to Nadia and to the person she was talking to. So it's on that basis that Nadia can say, this congresswoman was projecting onto her a particular religious identity, but you could hold up that Bible and reference other kinds of religions as well and other interpretations. And what Nadia didn't say, but I'm inferring, is that this wasn't just particular to this one exchange, but it had bearing on the whole question of homosexuality and so on and so forth, that you, Nadia, were asking about in your research project. So that's one question on, is the metaphor that you have encountered part of a much, do you encounter it elsewhere? Or is it only particular to that one interview? In which case you have some decisions to make about its centrality to your analysis. And I would say the same thing, the same point holds for other artifacts, whether they're objects or parts of speech or et cetera, whatever one can look at. Then you've got the question of how far, as you put it in your own question, how far can you go beyond the meanings communicated by the interviewees. Here is where it also is important to know whether it is just something articulated by this one individual or whether you find it elsewhere. Because if you find it elsewhere, then you have the ability to bring all of these different interpretations together and make your analysis more robust. And I should stop there.
Yeah, I'll just add, building on what Devorah has said in terms of not going too far, as Fred Schaefer has written about, building on Geertz, most interpretivists are going to contrast the experience near understandings of the people that they're interviewing with experience distant or the scholarly. So you can have that nice contrast between how most people are thinking and understanding in the group of people that you're interviewing with the scholarly concepts and literatures that are of most interest to you. So one of the things that you hear across both Nadia and Robin is this notion of taking the interviews and putting them in context. And that context is both the broader field, I think, as Robin was emphasizing, right, that she was taught what are the broadest contours of that, but also the scholarly literature that you're addressing.
Someone asked in the chat about resources for interpretive policy analysis. We will add those to the resource sheet that we'll be sending out after this session is over.
Oh, and Robin, you were going to chime in here, please.
Yeah, I am. One of the things also in figuring out how far it is to think about how the artifact or about the metaphor is the issue at hand is like other similar kinds of relationships, similar kinds of circumstances. So for instance, I'll go back to my own example of studying citizenship, is thinking about what other kinds of relationships, what other kinds of instances are like the naturalization ceremony. When do we bring people into a connection? So it could be something of thinking about at a marriage or at a Greek life, a sorority or a fraternity, in an American college situation of thinking about how you join people together, about a religious conversion, even about joining a sports team and sports teams as a whole. So all of these kinds of things are questions about joining and belonging, and really thinking about what those parameters are and helping you then to understand what the shape is and what the questions are in a larger sense of what it is to join a new community. So.
Can we check in? Perry, you mentioned Fred Schaefer before. If Fred is still there, can we check in and see, Fred, if you've got something to add to this conversation?
Yeah, it's a really interesting conversation, and I really appreciate the thoughtfulness with which all of you have answered it. The one distinction which I think might be helpful to draw is between subjective understandings and intersubjective understandings. I think that's really swirling around here in the background.
Great, thanks.
And often, at least in the kind of interviewing that I do and in certain other kinds of interviewing, what we're really after is really trying to figure out what the intersubjective understandings are. And I think it's a different kind of confirmation process, if you like. There's a different kind of relationship to, let's call it something like truth. For intersubjective, you can really ask the question, is what I'm hearing specific to this individual? Am I listening to an idiosyncratic speaker? Or is this an expression of something that's intersubjectively shared? And one can be right or wrong about that question, right? Is this subjective or is this intersubjective? So I think different kinds of interviewing have different kinds of relationships to this question, is it true? And so I think it makes sense in talking about interpretive interviewing to actually distinguish between different, I think there are different kinds of interpretive interviewing, and what counts as confirmation, what kind of relationship the interview has to truth, small t truth. It will be different for each of these different kinds of interviewing.
Is there something more that you could say briefly about how you see these different kinds of interviewing?
Yeah, so for instance, the kind of interviewing that I do, right, which I call ordinary language interviewing, I'm interested in understanding the concepts, the shared concepts by which people understand and navigate the world. And so when somebody shares with me or uses a term of interest in a way that seems to indicate what they understand the term to mean, I'll work up what I think the term means, right? Okay, I think I have it. And then I will conduct another set of confirmatory interviews where I'll ask another set of people whether whether the distinctions I'm drawing sound right. I'll give them an example, and if I'm right, if I really understand, the meaning of the term, they should answer in a way that I've predicted. And as a template, let me give you an example of what that kind of confirmation question might look like. And this one I'll draw from John Austin in his book How to Do Things with Words, I believe it's in. So he says. So, all right, so let's imagine you and I are sitting on the porch of my house and we're looking out in a field, and you and I each have a donkey, and they're out grazing in the field. And then all of a sudden, I develop this strong dislike of my donkey. And I take out my gun. Austin often uses these kinds of examples. Somebody needs to write a psychoanalysis of him. But anyway, so I take out my gun, and I shoot at my donkey. And between the moment that I pull the trigger and the bullet arrives, your donkey moves in front of my donkey, and your donkey drops down dead. Did I shoot your donkey by accident or by mistake? All right, so just think about that question. You could put your answer in the chat. And now let's rewind the situation, right? You and I are sitting on the porch. Our two donkeys are out grazing in the field. And again, I develop this strong, urge to kill my donkey. So I take out my gun and I shoot and I fire. And as we walk up to the donkeys, and then as we get closer, I see that it was actually your donkey that I shot, not mine. Did I shoot your donkey by accident or by mistake? All right. And again, if I've understood the distinction between accident and mistake, I should be able to predict how you answer, right? So in the second case, right, when I thought I was shooting my donkey, but in fact I shot at your donkey, right? I mistook, right, your donkey for my donkey. And when it got closer, I could recognize that mistake. But in the other one, right, it was an accident. After I pulled the trigger, your donkey moved in front of me, right? And so that kind of answer, I can ask that kind of question, and if I understand the use of the terms correctly, I should be able to predict what somebody answers, so I can either confirm or disconfirm my understandings.
Can I check something with you? And then we need to move on to the next segment. You're saying if you understand, and knowing you and your research, I think what you mean is if you understand how those terms are meant in a particular context.
Yes. Yes, absolutely. Right. And
Right.
here, right. And that's really another really important point, is that context always matters, right?
Yeah.
In interpretive research in general and in the use of language, right? It's
Yeah.
absolutely essential to designate the context.
Yeah. Thanks for those contributions, Fred and Robin and Nadia. Fred, I've got to say, the example for me was a little bit too close, given the circumstances in the events in the United States of the last couple of days or 24 hours in particular. And before that, everything that Nadia referenced earlier. But it is vivid, and I feel badly for the donkeys. Moving on to the second segment then. We have, again, two questions, but there's a difference here, or actually two differences. The first question was put by Lauren Moten, I think she says, who's a PhD student at John Jay College at the City University of New York, who in the end couldn't join us, but she gave us permission to put her question on the table. And the question is, what are some strategies for recruitment of hard to reach and vulnerable populations? We have a second question from Kandan Turkan, who's assistant professor at Kandan. I'm going to butcher the name of the university, so would you please unmute yourself and tell me how to pronounce it, and then pose your question?
Sure. I'm an assistant professor. I'm actually a political scientist, but I work on food. So I'm in a gastronomy and culinary arts program at Özyeğin University in Istanbul. And
Zine?
my name, huh?
Ozine?
Yeah, that's actually pretty
Thank
good.
you.
And my name is actually Candan. So C is read as J.
I'm sorry.
It's completely
I'm
fine.
sorry.
It's completely fine. I actually go with C. Everyone calls me C, so it's completely fine. My question is actually coming from speaking with farmers, and it has to do with figuring out whether someone is lying. And the intention here is not to get to the objective truth of things, but to understand that a lie is a lie. The question is, how do you handle lying in the interviews, particularly when going to the sites and interviewing others to do verification or using other methods to do triangulation is not possible? And I'll give an example to make things slightly clearer. In the golden days before pandemic, I would go to the farms and talk to farmers about, especially if they are smallholders, you know, how their situation is, how is the business essentially, or what are some of the problems that they're having accessing market. Because I am in Istanbul, largest city in Turkey, and we actually have a significant farmer population around the city, but they have significant market access problems. So I would essentially ask them questions, figuring out what their market access problems are. And it would eventually boil down to them telling me, you know, in various ways, how they don't have access. But then, and they would usually talk about, you know, how they don't have animals, for example, or how their plot is too small, so they're not generating enough income. But then, you know, walking around the farm, suddenly I would see animals, or I would smell animals. And, you know, there would be some awkward silences, or like everybody looking at each other, and we are trying to figure out what's going to be next. And I would just make a small note. And this is important to me, and I'm not obviously trying to correct him. He's telling me that lie for a reason, and that reason itself is why I'm in the field. That's what matters to me. I don't care if he has cows or sheep or chickens or, I don't know, whatever, donkeys.
Donkeys.
Exactly. But knowing that lie was important to me, because then when I am later on going through my notes, you know, I would say, okay, so even when they have animals, they cannot still make ends meet and look for alternative sources of income, etc., etc. So that would become a data point for me. And now I have to do Zoom interviews, which is just horrible. And I have to take everyone at their word. And that's the end of discussion. I can't go to the farms. I can't smell anything. And well, actually, thankfully, I'm healthy and I can smell things, but I'm at the cows and the sheep and etc. So I'm trying to really figure out, and I'm in the middle of research right now. I'm actually in the middle of fieldwork. I was doing interviews like 2 hours ago. I need to figure out how to solve this very practical problem because I don't know if they're lying or not. I don't even know if they're lying or not. So what do I do? Thank you. I'm sorry for taking so much time.
And thank you also for the elaboration, because again, that helps us understand. Perry, did you want to say something before we turn to Robin?
Yes, so when we got these questions, we looked at some of the words in the questions: recruitment, verification, triangulation. And part of what I just wanted to bring up before we get to the substance is to distinguish between ordinary language words and kind of methodological terms of art. So there are certain words that are perfectly good words in your everyday language: recruitment, sampling, hypothesis. But Devor and I were very careful in interpretive research design to note that there are other methodological terms that you can use or develop that are more in keeping with an interpretive, ontological, and epistemological sensibility. So instead of talking about sampling, talk about selection. Instead of talking about reliability and validity and verification, talk about trustworthiness. So if you look at Leanne Fuji's third chapter, it's entitled Selecting, Finding, and Approaching Interviewees, rather than the word recruitment. And it's not that there's anything wrong with the word recruitment or hypothesis as ordinary language terms, but that when you're writing up for an article or a book or in methodological discussions, hypothesis usually signals that you're doing hypothesis testing work, more positivist work. So, you know, if you think about Sherlock Holmes, yes, he used the word hypothesis, but he didn't do formal hypothesis testing. So when you formulate questions or talk in an interpretivist manner, you're trying to use a different vocabulary, different terms of art that will signal your interpretivist approach so that their brains aren't captured and they're thinking about statistics. So that's kind of an aside. And if we want to get to the substance, Robin and Nadia.
So I want to actually piggyback onto what you're talking about, which is also not just changing the vocabulary that we're using, but changing the imagination of what an interview is. And I want us to leave this idea to unmoor the interview from the 1 hour that we've said in our IRB applications that we're going to spend with people, and think of it much, much more broadly. And the interview, I think, begins from the moment you start thinking about, what am I planning to do? What am I trying to find out? And this helps with the ability to attract people by rethinking it. So in the first part of this, you have kind of this, like, I'm going to call like a working draft interview, where you're really talking to yourself to develop the kind of questionnaire that you're going to use out in the field, which will be absolutely useless after your first couple of discussions with people of really understanding how this semi-structured open-ended questionnaire and these conversations will flow. Because one of the key things that's going to happen when you're out in the field is that, as you know, is that you really have to be a really good listener and really engage with the people who are there. So it's not so much the questions even that you're asking, but the answers and the answers they're supplying and the questions they're asking you, and how you then question your own data. So you begin with this first like working draft interview, and then you start these like contact interviews, of figuring out who knows anybody. And I mean anybody in the place that you're going to, and try to figure out how you can get contacts both beforehand, before you ever leave, and then once you get there. And anybody can be helpful. And I don't want to use the word useful. I want to say helpful in trying to engage you in these conversations that are going on within research. When you, then once you get to the place, you have to use whatever you have, any kind of contacts that you have. I will tell you, I've done a lot of field work with bringing my children along, not out of choice, but out of lack of childcare. And I have shamelessly used them to introduce me to people in the field. So they would go to a local school, for instance, and now I had access to the administrators, the teachers, the security guards, the support staff, the cleaning people, everybody there. And they would say to me, "What are you doing here, lady?" And I would start to explain, and then ask them, do you know anybody who might be willing to let me give a talk at their place? And you should assume that everybody has, connections to something. And the least likely person may be the person who introduces you to an opportunity. I also, took a very old-fashioned view when I was doing researching in Germany, and they had like a list, a book, like a guide of all the different kinds of immigrant organizations that existed in Berlin. And I started at A and went to Z. And I'm going to say something that, I'm very old-fashioned. I believe face-to-face when it's possible, not in pandemic time, is absolutely the best. But you can write, you can text, you can Instagram, you can use everything that you have to try to meet people and make connections through these things. But in these interviews, when I first went, I explained to the people, and I asked them even for like an elite interview, and talked to them about like the process of engaging and everything else. And then said, oh, could I perhaps, make a talk at some meeting that they had, or else a lot of the times the people would say, well, that's really interesting what you're doing. Maybe we could set something up and you could be here on a regular basis. And then this was kind of amazing that like every, say, Thursday, I would be there, and anybody who walked into the organization could then meet with me. And people would see people going into a room, and they'd come out and they'd say, what are you doing? And then they would tell them, and send the other person would say, well, that's kind of interesting, or I want to do that too. And that's also because people thought that they were being heard. And so by providing this opportunity to be heard and this opportunity to speak, both things, that I was really able to offer something, and that something to people who, at least for a lot of my interview partners, nobody listens to them, or they can't tell the truth to somebody because it would be too painful to tell somebody back home what's really going on. So they could tell me. And so I really, wanted to create an environment where they could tell me things. And I think also for some of the people who came to talk to me, the opportunity of connecting with others was also because a lot of them were working at levels very different than the socioeconomic level that they worked at home, socioeducational level, excuse me, than they had at home. So this was an opportunity for them to participate in a professional activity where in their new life, they weren't working as a professional at all. And so they could get really engaged into it. And so they felt like they were participating in something that reminded them of where they were. And these people then would also be very interested in trying to connect me to other people. And I really have to say the number of times that somebody said something like, I've been waiting my whole life for someone to ask these questions. Or, and again, I return to this idea of being an outsider. They would say, why is it that an American has to come here to ask me these questions? Why didn't somebody from here ask? And it gave like a really nice way to do that. Okay, so you've, really at this point, like your interview, you've already had multiple kinds of like content interviews, context interviews, all of these other interviews that aren't like the interview. And then I would say, as a political scientist, so like you're engaging in these questions while you're having the official interview, and using then even that opportunity to ask people about, other places, other ways that you could talk to people, to develop like your list, and not really asking. I have a lot of trouble with snowballing because it seems kind of uncomfortable to ask people to name their friends and give their phone numbers. But I ask I ask openly, if you have someone who could contact me to, let them know. And sometimes people have even called from the interview room, which is really kind of interesting, and saying like, you got to do this. This thing is really crazy. So in a good way, crazy. So that's been very positive. And then the final interview that comes in my mind before you've begun any coding is after your interview has concluded, it's with yourself. And that you really have to take the time to do your field notes. And this goes back, I think, to the training that I got in interviewing, that this is an absolutely critical part, to set aside the time to really interview yourself about what just happened, what do I think of it, what kind of questions do I have, what went right, what went wrong, and all of it, and really be brutally honest about the experience, and then raise lots of questions about what needs to be changed. So if we stop thinking about the interview as this 1 hour and more about this gigantic process, it helps us really to think about other ways and places to connect us to different people. And I think if we show the people the respect for their time, for their thoughts, this is really the this is the way that you make the interviewing, really, that you connect with new people and you make the interviewing count.
Thanks, Robin, very much.
Okay.
Shall we move on to Nadia?
So I'll answer from a different perspective, because again, my focus is usually on political elites. So my recruitment strategies and tactics are different, as well as COVID challenges to doing this work are also somewhat different. So what's worked for me in the past is recruitment through, so I do all the things you're supposed to do from IRB, right? And as Robin said, IRB is not the end all be all. It's really the university's way to protect the university from anything that can go bad, not really looking out for the people that you're trying to speak with. But so I do all of that, but how I find the more fruitful and really in-depth interviews actually come from me and the project being introduced by members of that community. So my first book project, I was introduced by the chair of the Congressional Black Caucus. And that just opened the floodgates. So just real quick, I was, I did all the letters, the emails, the follow-up phone calls, nothing. And so I go to the State House and I'm sitting outside of one of the legislators' doors, and one of her staffers comes out and says, what are you here for? And I tell her about the project. And she brings me in. The legislator takes one look at me and holds me by my hand and says, come on, baby. And she takes me downstairs to the caucus room and said, we're having a caucus meeting. And she has me stand up and says, tell them about yourself, tell them your name, help the baby. She's here to do research on us. She's one of us, help her. And so what's read on to me at that point, right, is that I'm a young Black woman who, and I'm not taking the term, baby as a derogatory term, but one of like a sign of endearment that this older Black woman is trying to look out for me in the kind of connective kin ways that Black folks use to talk with one another. And so that helped the baby out, that 5-minute kind of introduction of her, holding my hand and walking me down into the caucus room was really what set off my interviews. And because I got that one endorsement, it really opened up the door to so many others. Since then, I've been able to have similar endorsements. So I worked with the Black Women's PAC Political Action Committee of Texas, and was able to do the first ever focus groups of Black women elected officials, like ever, period, hands down. And that was because of the organization. So I would share that, try multiple ways to get access to participants, but relationships, as I said in the chat, relationships is really key. And if you're trying to get into a group of people that, like political elites, are sometimes untrusting of researchers, because, and it's been told to me multiple times that because our work, academic work is so slow to be disseminated. So they might have talked to you 3 years ago and the book comes out, right, 3 years later. So they have no idea what's happened to the kind of interviews that they've given. They don't see any tangible outcomes. And so they're concerned, right? On the other hand, what they're mostly used to is talking to reporters who are going to write up something quick, maybe take a soundbite from what they said, perhaps out of context, or to do some kind of work within the journalistic, whatever that journalist wants to angle they want to push, and it might not have been what the legislator said. And this particularly happens to Black folks, to women, to queer folks, to immigrants, right? Legislators who are outside of the dominant norm, and they are more reluctant to speak. So I had to do a lot of work to say, I'm not a reporter, or I'm not going to use this work in the academic sense like you've experienced with reporters. So having those relationships with the First Congressional Black Caucus, and then the Black Women's PAC of Texas, and then others has really helped. So like Robin, the snowball sampling for me has been key. Do you know a friend? Can you recommend anyone that I talk with? And at some point, right, they've already seen my, dear legislator, will you interview with me? They've ignored it, but getting that personal, oh, I spoke with Nadia, she was, this wasn't what we think it is. That has gone such a long way. And then for the lying, so that's also, I think, as all probably all of us on this call can attest to, this has happened before. And in one of my circumstances, I was talking to a legislator, and I just happened to know his cousin, and I didn't connect them at all. But when I told the cousin that I had one of my most disappointing interviews, and this was maybe 6 months later after I had the interview, he called his cousin and he said, no, talk to her again, right? Like, that's not, she's not going to do anything bad. But he gave me, the legislator gave me one of the shortest interviews I've ever had. I think it was about like 10 minutes. And it was a very non-answer answer to all of the things that I asked. And then when my friend from college said, oh yeah, that's my cousin, and we had another talk, she's like, oh man, you should have led with this. It's like, well, I don't know your family, right? I don't know who you're related to. I can't make these connections. But right, it goes to an example of saying, the ways that particularly marginalized communities feel like they don't want to talk. And then once they get to that kind of introduction or feel more comfortable, the floodgates open, right? And then his interview wasn't necessarily very generative for the project that I was working on, but it was illuminating that, just how guarded he was. And so the ways that I got around that was listening to the silences. So why didn't he want to tell me something, right? And this is kind of going back to your question, C, right? So it's like the triangulation of like, why are you lying? And what comes out of this, and the other participants that I've talked to that haven't told me the full truth, and as being legislators, right, they were protecting their legislative identity. They're thinking about re-election. They're thinking about, I don't want to say something that might be misconstrued some way and my constituents might be upset. I'm asking about policy questions that they might not have made a full decision on yet, or they don't want to come public with, right? So I'm thinking about the pragmatic ways in which lying might be good for them. And oftentimes I'm able to triangulate this, again, like doing research on elites, with how they voted, what they've said to newspaper reporters, or what they've posted on their own social media page, who they're receiving campaign donations from, right? Who are people that they have situated themselves with inside of the legislature, right? So are they closest to this group over here? Do they sponsor bills with this people over here? And how are they voting, right? So these are all kind of ways that I'm able to kind of figure out what I think the motivation behind the lie is. But again, it's just what I think the motivation behind the lie is. And that's back to this first question of subjectivity, right? Like, I don't know, they're not telling us, but I'm trying to use multiple sources of data to figure out why. And then so lastly, to these Zoom challenges of interviewing. So I, like you, right, I'm doing interviews, trying to collect research during Zoom, and it's been particularly challenging for some regular issues like tech problems, right? People have spotty Wi-Fi, or the tech isn't working, right? All of those things that like we're all over familiar with. But then also, I found some newer interesting challenges when participants want to call in and talk about issues around race and gender, but don't see me, right? Like they don't see me as a Black person. And then, so I've had an interview with a legislator who sponsored the Crown Act in New Jersey. And the Crown Act is a bill again that forbids hair-based discrimination. And it's targeted to people with Afro-textured hair. Well, I have Afro-textured hair, right? So a lot of things like I get. But the legislator that I spoke with didn't know I was Black until the very end of the conversation, right? And so she's explaining to me, her position on the Crown Act, but a very kind of hands-off, like, she's not really talking as much about racial discrimination as she is talking about the employment discrimination as a byproduct of racial discrimination. And then at the end of the interview, she asks, have I heard of this children's book about embracing your natural hair? And I said, yes, right, I have 3 little kids, we read this book. And she was like, oh, right? It's like, yes, I get it, right? Like you didn't have to necessarily. So I think the interview would have been much different, because in the other interviews that I conducted with legislators around this bill, the cameras were on Zoom. So as soon as they turned on, they saw that I also had natural hair. They saw that I was, that I'm Black. And usually they heard a kid, or sometimes even saw a kid run in here, right, to like do all the kid things. And so it was a very, very different kind of conversation. And so what I had to be really serious about is the challenges of doing work with people who are already guarded, right? And how technology makes this much more difficult. And one of the things that I wish my prayer is that our discipline gets real, is that when Earth 2.0 opens up, or we pretend that COVID isn't a thing anymore, how does this impact people like us who do research through interactions with people? And Zoom is a poor proxy for it. Telephone is a really poor proxy. There's other things that we have been like, we planned on plan C, plan D, plan E, plan F. We've been in, we found ways to work around. We found new innovative things like, what is the picture that you want to put up? What is the story that you're telling here, right? Having access into people's homes and seeing what they have behind them, right? Like there's other ways that we have made Zoom useful for us, but I think it still doesn't replace that face-to-face. And so what does this mean for our research going forward? What will our books look like 5 years from now? What will our conferences look like when we're talking about, I'm not able to go into the field and do research? And particularly, I think about this for folks who are unsafe, or folks that are unhoused, folks that have insecurity, economic insecurity, or physical insecurity issues. So talking to people about experiencing domestic violence or sexual abuse and trauma can't be done via Zoom sometimes if you're living in the home with someone who is committing these acts against you. And you're having to talk about these things with them there, right? So this question of like lying or not being as transparent becomes very, very real. And I think we're going to have to think really systematically about how we ask these questions and how we can leverage leverage technology as a way to help us. But there are great, I'm trying not to be too Debbie Downer, but I think there are such great challenges that I want our discipline to really think about, particularly as we're thinking through how are graduate students going to, graduate, what their dissertation project's going to look like, what are promotion and tenure packets going to look like, what will funding applications look like when we're applying for grants to do this kind of work, and someone says, oh, just get on Zoom, you don't need to travel all the way to X or or Y or Z. Do you pay participants to talk with you when all they have to do is log on? All they have to do is log on to Zoom, right? I think these are some of the questions that I think we're going to have to deal with. But on the flip side, right, there are some advantages of bringing folks together in places that you would never have had the ability to talk to if it were not for Zoom. It's also got rid of this very ableistic, you know, everyone can hear, everyone can see. There's no need for transcription, right? That Zoom does some of this work that has been more equalizing in some other places. Mm-hmm. So I'll stop there, but I think we've just kind of, the pandemic has exacerbated some challenges, but it's all perhaps opened up a Pandora's box, but perhaps there's also some opportunities for us as interpretivists in there.
Yeah. Thanks so much, Nadia.
Thanks very much, Nadia.
Yeah.
To Chandan, let me just say that I think your question suggests a need to revisit what it means to tell a lie.
Yeah.
Because that posits the existence of a quote unquote objective reality that is true. And in science, in our kind of science, and I mean social sciences, what does it mean to move away from that presumption? And then how does that change the meaning of a lie? Or does it shift instead our attention to asking the question, why is someone lying? What is the significance of this quote unquote lie? And on that, if you're not familiar with it, Leanne Fuji published an article in 2010 called Shades of Truth and Lies, which is that's where she started with, because she said, my education taught me that if someone lies to me, I have to throw out that interview because it's not scientific. And so she does a very good job there, an excellent job of challenging all of those presuppositions. Also, I would say, and I'm making this very short because we're out of time and need to move on, but in the second methods clinic, the one that took up COVID and social media, part of the discussion there was on precisely this question of, if you can't be there yourself, you lose this other dimension that you and Nadia and Robin and others have been talking about. So it might be worth going back to that transcript, not the transcript, I'm sorry, the recording of that session and giving a listen to that part of it. Okay, Perry.
Yes, so Devin, I think we'll have time for about 10 minutes of a breakout room. So when you're in your breakout room, introduce yourselves and your research interests. Nobody's assigned to monitor this, and you'll get a time notice when we're about ready to come back all together and hear about the next session. So this is a little bit of an effort to meet some people in the interpretivist circle. Devin, can you assign us to breakout rooms?
Yes, they should be open now, and folks should be getting something on their screen prompting you to move to a room.
Looks like we had more time than we thought.
Yeah, welcome back. I hope you found those meetings and snippets of conversations helpful. I'll come back to that point in a minute. Our next clinic is going to be on May 21st. That will be the 5th one. What I started at the beginning of today's session to say is that today was the second of 3 methods for generating data. And that this was an accidental structure that emerged as Perry and I were figuring out how to organize these sessions. So what's the third mode of generating data? We don't have an easy enough name for that. The first one we can talk about as observing with whatever degree of participating. That was last month. Today we have talking to people, which includes interviewing. And the third one is what is perhaps best described as a close reading. And the question is, what are we reading? So our working title for next month's clinic is Documents and Beyond. But we want to try to burst the bounds beyond documents. So much of political science focuses on the written word or the spoken word. And so we tend to treat documents as objects, but there's so much more in the material world, like Nadia's Bible, or like Chandan's, well, Fred's donkeys and Chandan's animals, and so on and so forth. So we're going to try to burst those bounds and make it a wide-ranging discussion, and we're delighted that Michelle Weitzel from the University of Basel, who's been serving as our chat guru for the last 3 clinics, is going to join Perry and me. We're also going to change the format of this next one, and instead of rest on questions, we're going to treat it as a conversation and see where we go. So we hope you will join us for that one. And then a heads up for clinic number 6, which will be on June 25th. As I also said at the beginning and just alluded to now, we had the vision at the beginning that we would be gathering up to 25 people, and we could all sort of sit around this visual or virtual table and see each other and talk to each other and share issues in research and so forth. So Perry and I were quite blown away when so many people, several hundred in fact, signed up for these sessions. And what we want to do in the 6th clinic is try to create a setting that will get us closer to that original vision of the clinics. So we're trying to set up a structure that will enable fewer people to gather together. All of these will happen at the same time. It's a little bit too detailed to narrate right now, but as soon as we work out the final details, we will let you know what we're planning. And so please stay tuned, and we hope that you will join us for that one as well. Thanks again to Nadia and to Robin for sharing their experiences, to Fred Schaefer, who chimed in at a key moment, to everyone else who has joined us, and in particular, Zach, thank you for managing the chat, and Devin for managing the technology for us. We will be emailing out a recording of the session and a transcript of the chat, along with a resource sheet that has some additional materials that you might find of interest. So thank you to everybody. Have a wonderful weekend, wonderful day, and till next time.
Till next time. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you.